The transport ship smelled of antiseptic and recycled fear. Lena pressed her forehead against the cold porthole and watched the blue curve of Earth shrink until it was nothing, just a marble someone had dropped and forgotten. She was 7 years old. She did not cry. She had been told not to, by the social worker, by the treaty coordinator in the gray suit, by her mother, who had pressed both palms flat against Lena's cheeks and said very quietly, "You are the peace, baby. You are what keeps everyone alive." Lena had not known what to do with that weight, so she had tucked it somewhere under her ribs and tried to breathe around it. There were 99 other children on the ship. She knew this because the coordinator had announced it twice. She did not know their names. She sat alone in row 14 and looked at her hands, which were small and brown and entirely human, and she wondered what the Vorak would make of them. She had seen pictures. Everyone had seen pictures, but pictures from the war years were all black and smoke, all craters and body counts. The peace year photographs were different. The Vorak delegation at the signing table, standing 3 meters tall, their hide the deep gray-green of stormy ocean water, their 4 arms folded in a gesture that the diplomat said meant either honor or contempt. They were still arguing about it. Their heads were broad and angular, no real nose to speak of, eyes set wide like a prey animal that needed to see everything at once. Their mouths were horizontal slashes that moved when they spoke in a way that looked to Lena like something tearing slowly. The ship docked at a relay station above the planet Vorak, which the Vorak called something else, something that started with a sound no human throat could quite produce. The children were sorted into their assigned family units. Lena's card read, Garrison Family, Vorak, Warrior Caste. Climate, Arid High Altitude. Language Primer enclosed. No names. Just the word warrior, underlined. The escort who led her down the ramp was a Vorak female. She had learned to read gender from the ridge pattern above the secondary eyes, who wore the copper-colored sash of a treaty liaison. She did not touch Lena. She walked 3 careful steps ahead and paused whenever Lena's shorter legs fell behind. The air outside the station hit Lena like a wall, thin and dry and tasting of something mineral, like licking a hot stone. The sky was the wrong color. Not blue. Not quite purple. The sun was smaller and harsher, and everything it touched had an edge. The family was waiting at the base of the ramp. 2 adults and a juvenile. Vorak and his partner Vesa stood absolutely still in the way the language primer had described as a formal greeting posture, all 4 of their arms held slightly away from their bodies, palms forward. Their juvenile, who the primer said was called Ran, stood slightly behind them and stared at Lena with the wide-set eyes and said something very fast in Vorak that the earpiece translated, after a pause, as, "She's smaller than the pictures." Vorak made a sound that was not quite a click and not quite a word, and Ran went quiet. Lena stood at the bottom of the ramp with her one allowed bag and looked up at these 3 creatures who were now, by treaty, her family. She thought about her mother's hands on her face. She thought, I am the peace. I am what keeps everyone alive. Then she said, very carefully, in the 7 words of Vorak she had memorized on the ship, My name is Lena. I will try hard. Vorak looked at her for a long time with those wide, pale eyes. Then all 4 of his arms dropped to his sides, which the primer said meant accepted, and he said something the earpiece translated as, Then so will we. Keth, Year 1. The first thing Keth noticed about Earth was how wet the air was. On Vorak, you could taste the dryness, could feel it in the membranes between your plates. Here, the air pressed against you from all sides, heavy and warm and smelling of 1,000 green and rotting things. He stood outside the Pemberton Regional Airport in British Columbia and breathed it in and tried not to show that he was overwhelmed, because he was 8 years old and Vorak children of the warrior caste were not overwhelmed. He was smaller than the others of his cohort, which had been a source of some private shame at home. In human terms he came up to the shoulder of an adult, his hide still the pale gray-green of a juvenile, his secondary eyes not yet fully developed. They were closed slits above the primaries, which gave him, the liaison had told the human family, an expression humans might read as a little sad. He had not liked hearing this. The family was called Morrison. The father was named Dale and the mother was named Ruth, and there was a daughter named Clara who was 9 and who stood next to her parents at the arrivals gate and stared at Keth with round, forward-facing eyes that all humans had and that Keth found slightly unnerving, the way you couldn't tell what they were watching. He had studied the treaty briefings. He knew the protocols. He brought his primary arms forward and down in the greeting acceptance gesture and said in English, which he had been drilling for 4 months, I am Keth. I come in the condition of peace." Dale Morrison made a sound in his throat and reached out one of his two arms and touched Keth on the shoulder. Keth managed not to flinch. "Humans touched each other all the time," the briefings had said. "It meant welcome. It meant you were not alone." He filed this away. "We're real glad to have you, Keth," Dale said. "Real glad." Clara was still staring. She had a smear of something orange on her chin, and she smelled of a food Keth didn't recognize yet. Later he would learn it was peanut butter. She said, "Do you want to see our dog?" Keth did not know what a dog was. He said yes, because yes seemed like the safest answer, and Ruth Morrison laughed, a sound he hadn't expected, sudden and bright and startling as something breaking, and he felt the strangeness of the planet settle around him like a garment he didn't know how to wear. The drive to their farm took 2 hours. He sat in the back of the truck with Clara between him and the door, which she seemed to prefer, and he looked out the window at the mountains, enormous, patient, covered in green so dense it looked solid, and the sky, which was the most astonishing blue, a blue that seemed almost violent in its intensity, and he thought of his creche mother back on Vorak who had told him, "You carry our name into their world. You make them understand that we are not what the war made us." He had not fully understood then what she meant. He was beginning to. The farm was made of wood. This struck him as extraordinary, an entire structure of dead plant matter. He walked through it slowly, touching the walls. Ruth watched him do this and did not tell him to stop. She made food while Dale showed him his room, which was small and had a window that looked out over a field where 2 large animals stood in the rain. The bed was soft in a way that alarmed him. He would sleep on the floor for the first 3 weeks before Ruth quietly placed a firm foam mat beside the bed and said nothing about it. That night he lay on the floor and listened to the rain on the roof, a sound entirely unlike anything on Vorak, and catalogued what he knew: 2 parents, 1 sibling, 1 dog, a creature of moderate size that had immediately tried to put its mouth on his arm, and then licked him, and then fallen asleep on his foot, and that he was absolutely not going to admit he had found comforting. A farm. Blue sky. Wet air. A bed he couldn't use. A family he had no language for yet. He was 8 years old. He had 15 years to figure it out. Lena, year 2 and 3. The language came in pieces. First the nouns: thresh for water, vala for sky, Keth for the dominant wind that swept the plateau every evening like something remembering to be angry. Then the verbs, which in Vorak were not separate things but modifications of the noun they affected, so that water moving and sky moving and wind moving were not 3 different ideas but the same idea wearing different skins. Lena's human brain kept wanting to separate things that Vorak grammar refused to separate, and she spent the second year living in a state of constant low-grade frustration that she could only express in English, which no one else in the garrison understood. Vorak was a warrior in the literal sense. He commanded a territorial unit that patrolled the plateau's eastern ridge for boundary violations, a holdover from the war that had not yet been disbanded because Vorak institutions changed slowly, like glaciers. He left before the sun rose and returned when it was low and spoke little in the evenings. He was not unkind. He was simply absent in a way that had nothing to do with physical distance. Vesa was the one who fed her, who checked her health monitors, who stood outside the room where Lena slept and listened, some nights, to make sure she was breathing. Ran was the one who talked. He was 10 when Lena arrived, 2 years older, already through his first growth and into a Vorak pre-adult phase that gave him height but not yet the composure to carry it. He told her the names of things constantly, following her around the garrison compound like a commentary track she hadn't asked for but couldn't turn off. He told her the name of every rock formation on the plateau, every type of wind, the correct way to read a Vorak sky for coming weather. He was, she realized gradually, as lonely as she was, not for want of contact but for want of someone who didn't already know all the things he wanted to say. It was Ran who taught her to climb the stone face east of the compound, a route he'd been forbidden to take alone. She followed him up it one morning before the patrol shifted and they sat at the top in the thin air and looked out over the plateau, and Lena said, in improving Vorak, "On my world, a child in my family would not climb this alone." "You're not alone," Ran said. "That's why it's allowed. Your father didn't say it was allowed." "My father didn't say it wasn't." He clicked what she had come to understand was his version of a grin, a quick lateral movement of the jaw that bared none of the inner plates but changed the shape of the whole face. "My father," he added, "was not raised Vorak. He was raised warrior. There's a difference." This was the first thing anyone had said to her that suggested Vorak culture was not a single uniform thing. She turned it over in her mind for days afterward. The hardest part of year 2 was not the language or the food. The food was another matter, a long and sometimes alarming story, but the nights. Vorak's nights were long, much longer than Earth's, and the dark was a different quality of dark, denser, colder, absolute. She would lie in her sleeping alcove and think about her mother with the precision of someone rationing a limited resource. She allowed herself 10 minutes per night. She counted them. After 10 minutes she would take the weight from under her ribs and say to it silently, "I am the peace. I am what keeps everyone alive." And then she would sleep, or try to. In year 3 she stopped counting. Not because she had stopped missing her mother, but because the alcove had started to feel like her alcove, and the dark had started to feel like her dark, and one morning she woke before the rest of the compound and climbed to the roof and watched the smaller sun come up over the eastern ridge and realized she had forgotten, for a moment, to think about where else she might be. She told no one about this. It felt like a kind of betrayal and also like a kind of survival, and she couldn't yet tell which one was stronger. Keth, year 2 and 3. School was the first war. Not the 50-year war, that was history class, taught by a man named Mr. Beaumont who had the careful voice of someone defusing something, but the small daily war of the hallway, the cafeteria, the school bus. Keth stood at 160 centimeters, which was tall for a Vorak juvenile and not quite tall enough for a human his age, and he stood differently, with the four-armed stillness of a caste that considered unnecessary movement a form of weakness. He also had 2 pairs of eyes, the secondary ones still opening and closing at irregular intervals as they developed, which the other children found either fascinating or unsettling and could not quite decide which. He understood about 60% of what was said to him in year 2. He nodded through the other 40. He ate his lunch at the end of the cafeteria table where the space was widest, because he needed more space than a human body required, and a boy named Trevor who sat 3 seats down announced one Tuesday that Keth's eating habits were disgusting, which was true in the sense that Vorak ate differently, more efficiently, more completely, but felt like something else when Trevor said it with that particular narrowing of the forward-facing eyes. Clara intervened. She was 9, a year younger than Keth, and she sat herself next to Trevor and said in a voice that was somehow both very small and very absolute, "His name is Keth, and if you say that again I'll tell Mr. Beaumont you copied off my test." She had, Keth later learned, made this up entirely. Trevor said nothing more. After that, Clara became his school guide, his translator not of language but of social code. She explained why people hugged. She explained what it meant when someone looked at the floor instead of at you. She explained the concept of a joke, not the mechanics, which he understood, but the precise art of timing, the specific pause before the punchline that meant now you're allowed to laugh. He practiced this for weeks. When he finally deployed it correctly, a dry observation about the school's cafeteria food that made Dale laugh so hard he choked on his coffee. He felt a satisfaction entirely out of proportion to the event. Ruth was the one he trusted first, before Dale, before Clara, before any of them. She moved through the farmhouse with the unhurried competence of someone who had been solving problems quietly her whole life. She cooked food that she modified without comment. The fire-dried meat that Keth's physiology needed she sourced from a specialty supplier 2 towns over, never mentioning the cost or the logistics. When his secondary eyes opened fully in year 2 and he couldn't control the reflex that made them track movement independently of his primaries, she sat with him at the kitchen table after the others were in bed and said, "Does it hurt?" "No," he said. "It is disorienting. Like 2 channels at once." "Yes, exactly that. That sounds exhausting." She poured him a cup of the warm grain drink she'd learned he could tolerate, which she called tea and he thought of as the brown comfort. "Dale gets migraines," she said. "He says it's like 2 drums in his head. He puts a cool cloth over his eyes and lies in the dark, and Clara and I talk quieter for a day. We can do something like that for you, if it gets too much." He looked at her with his primary eyes and let his secondary ones rest. "You don't have to adjust for me," he said. "I know we don't have to," she said. "That's not the same thing as not wanting to." He filed this away in the growing archive of things humans did that his briefings had not predicted. By year 3 he was sleeping in the bed. He was also, without having consciously planned it, helping Dale with the fence line every Saturday morning, which was not something he had been asked to do, but which he had begun because it needed doing and he was there. Dale had not commented on it the first time. He had just handed Keth the other end of the wire, and they had worked in companionable silence for 2 hours, and when they were done Dale had said, "Good work," in the same voice he'd use for any member of the family, and Keth had understood that this was the closest Dale knew how to get to what Ruth had said at the kitchen table, which was, "I want to." Lena, years 4 through 7. Vorak began training her in year 4. This was not in any treaty document, not approved by any coordinator. It happened because one morning she followed him to the eastern ridge without permission. She was 10 and had recently discovered that the worst things could do was say no, and instead of sending her back he watched her for a long time and then said, "You're looking at the wrong parts of the sky." She looked at him. "Weather comes from the southeast. You were watching north." He sat down on a flat stone in the way that Vorak warriors sat when they were being deliberately patient, 2 arms braced behind them, 2 resting across their knees. "Sit." She sat. Over the following 3 years he taught her to read weather, to track the small desert creatures that moved in the talus below the ridge, to understand the marks that territorial disputes left on stone. He taught her slowly, without praise, the way Vorak taught. The withholding of acknowledgement was not coldness but a specific kind of respect, the understanding that your student was competent enough to evaluate their own work. Lena had spent years thinking Vorak was simply uncommunicative. Now she understood he was saying something entirely different through his silence. "You can do this. I do not need to reassure you because you are not someone who needs reassurance." It broke something open in her. She had not known she needed to be trusted rather than comforted until she was being trusted, and the difference was like the difference between being handed something and being shown that you could carry it yourself. Vesa was the one who talked about the war. Not often, once or twice a year, on specific anniversaries that Lena only gradually came to understand the significance of. She would take down a plane case from a high shelf and open it and show Lena what was inside: medals, recording tablets, a dried piece of something organic that Lena once worked up the courage to ask about, and Vesa said, "My hatchmate. He died in the 3rd campaign. Humans call that year the Meridian Push." She said this without inflection. "I keep the peace so I can explain. So when they tell you about that battle, and they will, your history keepers and ours, you know that on our side, there was someone whose name was Darren, and he died because soldiers who were frightened made a decision that frightened soldiers make." She closed the case. The name our historians give that battle is different. The outcome they describe is the same. Almost everything about that war looks different from each side and is exactly the same from the inside. Lena asked, "Do you hate humans?" Vesa was quiet for a moment. "I hated the war," she said at last. "That's not the same thing. But it is not entirely different, either. I am working on the difference." She looked at Lena, the wide-set Vorak eyes that could see almost entirely around the head, that missed almost nothing. "Are you?" "Yes," Lena said, and meant it. In year 7 she spoke Vorak more naturally than she spoke English. She noticed this not with alarm but with a quiet, wondering attention, the way you might notice that you've grown taller than a doorframe you used to pass under easily. Her English came back fully when she used it. She kept a handwritten journal in it, partly as a discipline and partly because the act of writing in her mother's language felt like holding a hand across a very large distance, but in the daily texture of her thought, she moved through Vorak structures. She dreamed in both. Ran was 15 now and had begun the adult plating that would eventually give him the armor-like exterior of a full Vorak warrior. He was becoming someone different from the boy who had followed her around naming rocks, and she was becoming someone different from the girl who had memorized 7 words on a ship. They were growing up around and through the same specific experience, 2 people shaped by the same strange circumstances, and what existed between them was not quite friendship by Vorak definition and not quite what her English language memory called friendship either. It was something that required the grammar of both languages and still fell slightly short. Keth, years 4 through 7. He found the accordion in the barn in year 4. It had belonged to Ruth's father, and it was old and slightly out of tune, and it made a sound like a large animal learning to breathe. He found it on a rainy Saturday and brought it inside, and Ruth's face did something complicated and then cleared into a smile. "I didn't know that was still out there," she said. "What is its function?" he asked. "Music. It makes music. Here." She sat beside him and showed him the bellows, the buttons, the wheeze and pull of it. He held it in 2 of his arms and found the position awkward. She adjusted his grip with a patience he had come to understand was a specific skill of hers, the ability to show someone how to hold a thing without making them feel wrong for having held it differently. He was not musical by Vorak standards. Vorak music was percussive, structural, almost mathematical. It was about patterns and their interruption. The accordion was about something else entirely, about breath, about the feeling between notes, about the way a melody could suggest an emotion without naming it, which struck Keth as both inefficient and profound. He practiced in the barn for a year before he played in front of anyone. The first person he played for was Clara. Clara was 12 by then and had taken on a quality that Keth found difficult to name. She was not older than her age. She was precisely her age, very completely 12, with all the uncertainty and sudden intensity that seemed to characterize human pre-adults, but she had grown up next to Keth, which had given her an unusual fluency in the concept of different. She did not explain him to her school friends. She simply existed next to him without apology, which he had come to understand was its own kind of statement. She listened to him play the accordion and then said, "You sound sad." "I don't feel sad," he said. "I know. But it sounds like you're trying to say something you don't have words for." He looked at her. "That's exactly what it is." "That's what music is for," she said, as if this were obvious, and went back inside, and Keth sat in the barn for a long time after that, understanding something new about what humans used beauty for. School became easier by degrees. He was not popular. He was too different, too still, too meticulous, with study habits that alarmed his teachers by their exactness, but he was respected. He had a quality the students called fair, and his teachers called rigorous, and that he would have called, in Vorak, Vethrak, the commitment to honesty without cruelty. When Trevor came to him in year 6 struggling with mathematics, the same Trevor who had grown into something less certain of himself, Keth helped him without reference to the cafeteria. Trevor did not thank him effusively. He just said, "Yeah, that helps," and Keth understood this was as much as was available, and it was enough. He wrote to his creche mother on Vorak through the treaty relay. The letters took 11 days each way, and the relay had a character limit that forced him to compress what he wanted to say until it was almost Vorak in its economy. He wrote about the farm, the accordion, the dog, whose name was Marshall and who was now 7 years old and moved more slowly but still sought out Keth's lowest pair of hands every evening. He wrote, "The humans do not always say what they mean, but they show it in other ways." This confused me. Now I think I was expecting them to say it, but I should have been watching. His creche mother wrote back, "This is what we hoped you would find." He did not tell her about the nights when the distance felt enormous, when the alien blue of the daytime sky seemed to contract in the dark into something that pressed on his chest, when he wished, not for Vorak exactly, but for a place where he did not have to translate himself to exist. He did not tell her because she was far away and could not help, and because somewhere around year 5, he had understood that the Morrisons were helping, in the quiet and specific ways they had, and that accepting help without cataloging it as debt was a human concept he was slowly learning to inhabit. Lena, years 8 through 11. She was 14 when she sent her first letter home in Vorak. She didn't do it deliberately. She started it in English and then found, 3 paragraphs in, that the thing she was trying to say wouldn't fit in English anymore, and she switched without thinking, and then she stared at the page and understood what that meant. She sent it in English. She wrote a separate version in Vorak in her journal, the precise thing she'd wanted to say, and closed the journal and did not look at it for a week. Her mother wrote back with the same care she always did. News of the neighborhood, news of her aunt's children who were growing up without Lena and whom Lena knew only from photographs. Her mother did not ask when Lena was coming home. She had understood, maybe better than anyone, that this question had an answer written into the treaty, 15 years, and then exchange, and that asking it would only make the distance larger. She asked instead, "What is the food like now? Can you taste anything good yet?" And Lena laughed, actually laughed, because the food was still largely terrible by human standards, but she had found 2 dishes, one involving a roasted root and the other a kind of grain preparation she couldn't quite describe, that she liked genuinely, not diplomatically. She was growing. Not just in height, though she was taller, but in the way she occupied space. Thuruk's training had given her a physical confidence that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with knowing where her body was in the world. She moved through the garrison compound with the ease of someone who had learned the terrain well enough to stop thinking about it. The other Vorak in the unit, she had come to know them, slowly, over years, had shifted in their manner toward her. Not warmth, not exactly. Vorak warrior units were not warm in the way families were. But a kind of inclusion that she understood was significant, a willingness to let her be in the same space without requiring her to explain herself. She was also, by 14, aware of things she had not been aware of before, or had been aware of only in the distant theoretical way of a child. The war had ended 7 years before she was born. She had been born in the 4th year of the peace, raised in the shadow of a history that everyone in her mother's neighborhood carried like bad weather. She had grown up hearing, the Vorak did this, and the Vorak destroyed that, and she had held this information, had never denied it, but she had also now held Vessa's case of memories and listened to Tharuk describe the battle he called the Long Silence, and she had understood in a way that no briefing or documentary had managed to convey. Both sides had done this. Both sides were carrying the same weight in different shapes. And both sides had sent their children across the black distance of space to sit with the weight of the other, to feel it from the inside. She asked Tharuk, one evening on the ridge, whether he believed the peace would hold. He was quiet for a long time. "I believe you are here," he said at last. "And that Rand's generation is growing up knowing that a human child climbed our rocks and ate our food and learned our sky. And that somewhere, a Vorak child is growing up knowing the same thing in reverse." He paused. Whether the ones who decide these things will let that be enough is a different question. "Do you trust them?" she asked. "I trust the weight," he said. "The politicians will do what politicians do. But 100 children carry weight that is hard to ignore." She was not sure she believed him. She was not sure he entirely believed himself. But she held the words anyway. Keth, years 8 through 11. Marshall died in year 8. It was the first death Keth had experienced at close range, and he was unprepared for the specific texture of the grief, the way a presence you had stopped noticing became enormous in its absence. He had not known he loved the dog. He had thought of his attachment to Marshall as a kind of practical fondness, a comfortable habit. When Dale came in from the barn with the news, and Clara made a sound that Keth had never heard her make before, and Ruth sat down heavily at the kitchen table, Keth stood in the doorway and felt something he could only describe, even to himself, in human terms, because Vorak didn't have a word for the grief of losing something you hadn't known you depended on. He sat with Clara on the porch for 2 hours that night. They didn't talk much. He held his accordion and played something slow and formless, and Clara leaned against the post and cried with the easy fluency that humans seem to have for tears, which Keth had always found remarkable, the way they could produce the physical expression of feeling without treating it as a vulnerability. He couldn't cry. Vorak physiology didn't produce tears. But he played, and the accordion breathed, and they sat together in the dark listening to the insects in the field that Marshall would not patrol again. "Do you miss home?" Clara asked eventually, the way people ask things they've been holding for a while. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "Less than I expected. More than I'm comfortable with." "What's more? The missing or the comfortable?" He considered this. "They're about the same." She nodded like this made sense to her. "I think you're going to be really far away one day," she said. "When you go back. And I think that's going to be strange." "Yes," he agreed. "It will be strange for me too." She was 13, and she was already thinking about the future with the serious practical sadness of someone who had grown up knowing that time had a structure. He was 13, and he was thinking the same thing, and sitting between them was the 7 years they had already spent and the 7 years remaining, and both of them understood without saying it that the people they were becoming would owe a very significant debt to this porch, this dark, this family. The farm was in him by now. Not in the nostalgic way he would feel about Duvrak's wind. That was home in the original sense, home as origin, but in the practical sense of a place that had shaped his hands. He knew the sound the fence made in wind. He knew which of the field soil was too wet and which too dry by the way his lower pair of feet registered the ground. He knew the rhythm of Ruth's seasons, the winter when she grew still and interior, the spring when she got up earlier and moved faster, the summer when Dale laughed more, the autumn that was his favorite, when everything smelled of turning and the light went amber over the mountains and the whole world seemed to be doing what he had learned to do, becoming something different while remaining entirely itself. School was a different experience now. His English was better than his Vorak had become from disuse. The treaty relay letters kept it alive but imperfectly, and he understood that this was its own kind of loss, something he ought to feel more about than he did, which made him feel guilty, which was perhaps the most human emotion he'd developed. His teacher, Mrs. Abe, told him he wrote with unusual precision and an unexpected feeling for metaphor, which he said as a compliment and which he received as a diagnosis. He was becoming someone made of 2 languages and 2 sets of hands and 2 ways of looking, and none of these things cancelled each other out. They just meant he was more than one thing at once, which he had initially experienced as division and now experienced as breadth. He was 12 when a journalist came to do a story on the Treaty Exchange children. She interviewed Dale and Ruth with a recorder and then asked if she could speak to Keth, and Ruth said Keth would decide that, and Keth said yes. The journalist asked, "What would you want people to know about your experience here?" He thought for a moment. He said, "That my family here is real. Not a substitute. Not a replacement. The same thing as a family, with different components." The journalist wrote it down. He read the article later and found that she had quoted him correctly, but that the article described him as remarkably well-adjusted, which he understood was meant kindly and which he also understood missed the point by a specific distance. Well-adjusted suggested that the distance had been bridged through effort. What he would have said, had he had more precise language, was that the distance had not been bridged at all. He was still himself, fully and completely, and he was also someone who had grown in a human field, and both things were true simultaneously without either one compromising the other. He was not adjusted. He was expanded. Lena, years 12 through 14. She turned 19 during year 12 on Vorak. Vesa prepared a dish that was, as close as she could approximate it, the meal Lena had described her mother making on birthdays. Something sweet, something warm, something that involved the slow application of care. The Vorak version was not quite right. The flavors were parallel rather than identical, but the gesture was so precisely calibrated to what a gesture of that kind required that Lena sat at the garrison table and held her emotions with both hands and said in Vorak, which was by now the language of her daily life, "This is very good. Thank you." Tharuk made the lateral jaw movement that she knew was the nearest his face could get to a smile. "You have been here 12 years, he said. "You have never once failed at what you set out to do." "I didn't set out to do anything," she said. "I was 7. My mother told me I was the piece." "Yes," he said. "And are you?" She thought about this. "I don't know. I think maybe the piece isn't a thing you are. I think it's a thing you make, a little at a time, by learning someone's sky and their food and their way of being silent." She looked at him. "I think you have to do it the way you taught me to read weather. Not all at once. In pieces. And you have to keep checking, because it changes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and this was, in Vorak, an extraordinarily intimate thing to say to someone who was not bloodkin, "You have been a good garrison daughter." She didn't speak. She didn't trust her voice. She looked at her hands, which had been small and brown and entirely human when she arrived, and which were still those things but were now also marked by 12 years of Duvrak, calloused differently, darkened by a smaller, fiercer sun, held in the particular stillness that Tharuk had spent years teaching her was not passivity but attention. Ran was 23 now and had been assigned to his own territorial post, and she saw him less, but when she did the ease between them was unchanged. He had, over the years, become her most precise translator, not of language, which she no longer needed translated, but of the subtler grammar of Vorak feeling, the distinction between the silence that meant grief and the silence that meant respect and the silence that meant "I don't have words for this either, but I am here." She was not Vorak. She had never pretended to be, and she had not become it in some careless, loss-of-self way. She was Lena, who was human, and she was also someone who had lived for 12 years inside a world that had no use for what she couldn't do and a great deal of use for what she could, and the person she was now was a direct product of both of those things. She had not been assimilated. She had been. She searched for the right word and found it in neither language perfectly, but found the nearest version in English. She had been grown. The way you grow things, with care and difficulty and time and the willingness to be changed by the soil you're planted in without losing the seed you started as. In year 13 she began to teach. Not formally, there was no school on the plateau, but informally, in the way that knowledge passed in garrison culture. She showed 2 of the younger junior warriors, both 7 years old, how to read the atmospheric pressure changes that preceded the plateau's most dangerous storms. She used Vorak technique entirely, because that was what worked here, on this rock, under this sun. But she also told them, on my world, whether readers look for different signs. Here are ours. Here, for comparison, are theirs. She drew both systems in the dust. She let them see how 2 different minds had solved the same problem differently, and she watched their faces do the thing that faces do when they encounter a surprising and useful idea. One of them asked, "Is your world like this one?" "No," she said. "It's wetter and bluer and everything on it is arranged differently. But the weather works the same way on the inside. Wind comes from somewhere. It goes somewhere. It picks things up and puts them down. Wherever you are, that's what wind does." The child looked at the sky with the new, testing attention of someone who has been handed a tool. Lena watched and felt something she would later describe in her journal as the specific satisfaction of passing something on before you leave. Because the leaving was coming. Year 15 was coming. She had known it always, had filed it under the weight beneath her ribs, had breathed around it for 12 years. Now it was near enough to feel the shape of Keth, years 12 through 14. Clara graduated high school in year 13 and applied to a university in Vancouver and got in. The night she found out, the Morrisons made a dinner that lasted 3 hours and expanded across the kitchen table in the way their dinners did when something important had happened. Dishes accumulating, someone always going back for more of something, the conversation growing branches. Keth played the accordion at the end. He had, over 9 years, become someone who could make the instrument say things he still didn't fully have words for, and he played that night with the specific feeling of someone who was proud of someone else and sad for himself and glad that both of those things were happening at the same time. Dale noticed. Dale had gotten better at noticing over the years, in the way people get better at things when they pay consistent attention. After Clara and Ruth had gone upstairs, he sat with Keth at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of the brown comfort and said, "Year 15's coming." "Yes," Keth said. "You thought about what it's going to be like? Going back?" "I have thought about it," Keth said. "I think it will be like arriving here was. Strange. Correct, but strange." He paused. "I think I will miss things." Dale wrapped both hands around his mug. He was a man who had always communicated through work, through fixing fences and maintaining machinery and staying up late on winter nights when the pipes threatened to freeze, and Keth had learned that his silences were the most articulate thing about him. This silence said, "I will miss things too." "The treaty people say there'll be contact," Dale said at last. "Letters. Maybe more, once the monitoring period's done." "Yes." Keth looked at his hands, both pairs, the upper resting on the table, the lower holding the mug. "I want to tell you something. I have wanted to say it for some time, and I was uncertain of the exact words." "Go ahead," Dale said. "When I arrived," Keth said carefully, "I thought of this as a placement, a position I would occupy. I had a framework for it that was formal, strategic. I was representing my species. I was not a child who had been left somewhere, I was an emissary. That was how I held it." He paused. "I don't hold it that way anymore. I don't know when it changed. I think it changed in pieces, the way the farm changes in autumn, no single moment, just a process." He looked at Dale. "You are my family. That is not diplomacy. That is what is true." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over Keth's upper pair, which was a gesture that would have alarmed the 8-year-old Keth enormously, and which the 21-year-old Keth received exactly as it was intended. "Yeah," Dale said. "Same here, son." The word landed in him like something placed very carefully in a specific spot that had been waiting for it. It was in year 14 that the political news began to change. Keth followed it through the treaty relay updates and through the human news services he'd been reading since year 9. A new government in the Human Concordat was using language about unresolved territorial boundaries and the insecurity of the current peace framework. On Vorak, the Warcast faction, which had always existed, was calling the exchange program a humiliation. An academic paper, widely circulated, vehemently disputed, argued that the 50-year war had never actually resolved the underlying resource conflicts and that the treaty was structural delay rather than structural change. Keth read these things with the attention of someone who lived in both worlds and recognized in the language the precise vocabulary of people who had decided on a conclusion and were now building the evidence toward it. He talked about it with Clara during one of her weekend visits from Vancouver. She was reading political science, and she read the same material with a fluency that had, in the past year, become the most alarming thing he'd encountered. "It's not inevitable," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it has been made to look that way, which is nearly as effective. They won't restart a war while the exchange children are still in their placements," she said. "Public opinion on both sides would. The exchange period ends in year 15, Keth said. For all of us. Simultaneously. She looked at him. He saw her understand it. That's not a coincidence, she said. No, he said. I don't think it is. Lena, year 15, month 1. The news came through the treaty relay on a gray morning when the plateau wind was high. Lena was up on the eastern ridge checking the weather instruments she'd helped install the previous year when Vessa's communication flag lit up her earpiece and she climbed down and went inside and read the relay text 3 times before she understood it. The Human Concordat government had announced what it was calling a security review of the treaty's territorial provisions. The Vorak High Council had responded with what was being translated as either concern or threat, depending on which translator you used. An emergency summit had been called. The treaty relay communications between exchanged children and their families were being put under enhanced monitoring. The return transport for Year 15 exchanged children was being reviewed for scheduling. In the war preparedness briefings that Thuruk's unit had received, which she was now, at 22, senior enough to attend, the maps being used were indistinguishable from the maps of the last war's opening campaigns. She called a full family meeting in the garrison that evening. This was not a human concept. It was not a standard Vorak concept either. It was something she had invented over 15 years in the space between the two, the practice of sitting together in the same room with the same information rather than processing it separately and presenting conclusions. Thuruk had resisted this for the first 7 years. Now he sat across from her with Vessa and Ran, who had come in from his post when she'd sent word, and he listened. They're going to restart the war, she said in Vorak. They've been planning it. The exchange program was a guarantee mechanism, not a peace mechanism. And now the guarantee is expiring. The exchange children returning doesn't mean the guarantee expires, Vessa said. The relationships are not in any document, Lena said. The relationships live in people. And people are not what governments cite when they build cases for war. Thuruk said nothing. He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her on the ridge in year 4, before he'd told her she was looking at the wrong part of the sky. She had learned what that look meant. He was measuring her. He was deciding whether she was competent enough to evaluate her own work. There are 99 other children like me, she said. Human children who have lived among Vorak for 15 years. And there are 100 Vorak children who have lived among humans. And when we all come back, we will be the 100 people on each side who know this with the most precision, and they know that, and that's why they want us back before they start anything, so they can point to the completed exchange and say the peace was attempted and it wasn't enough. Ran said, "What are you going to do?" She looked at him. She looked at Thuruk. She looked at Vessa, who had a case on a high shelf containing the piece of her hatchmate who had died in a war that should have been unnecessary. "I'm going to talk to the other exchange children," she said. "All of them. And then I'm going to go home. And then I'm going to keep talking." Keth, year 15, month 1. He had been building the case for 6 weeks when the official recall notice arrived. Return transport would be provided, it said, which in the treaty's language meant mandatory, on the first available relay window. The Human Concordat was issuing reciprocal recall orders for its placed children simultaneously. The summit had broken down. Enhanced monitoring of relay communications was now active. He sat at the kitchen table with a notice and all 4 of his hands very still and thought about everything he knew about what came next. He had, by 22, a better model of human political behavior than almost any Vorak alive who had not lived in it. He knew the mechanisms. He knew the language. He knew, specifically, the way that populations who have been told they are afraid become afraid in ways that are real and physiological and that can then be pointed to as evidence that the fear was warranted all along. He also knew that he had 99 counterparts on Vorak who knew, by now, the mechanisms of Vorak political behavior. And he knew that all 200 of them were, simultaneously, receiving this same moment of clarity about what was being built around them. He called Lena. This was not something he had ever done. They had not been in contact. The exchange children had been deliberately segregated by placement, each in their own singular experience, no support network. The isolation was part of the design. But he had her relay address from the treaty directory, and the enhanced monitoring meant any communication would be flagged. And he decided that being flagged for this particular communication was a risk he was able to accept. She picked up on the second signal and said, in a Vorak accent that was the most disorienting sound he'd ever heard from a human mouth. "You got the recall too?" "Yes," he said. "I've been talking to 8 of the others here. There are 27 who want to coordinate." "I've contacted 12 on this side," he said. "Keth, the plateau ones, 6 of them are in." There was a pause across the relay. Then Lena said, in English, she switched, he registered, when she wanted to be precise in a way that Vorak grammar resisted, "We have to go back. We don't have a choice about that. But what we do when we get there, that's ours." "Yes," he said. "I know. Are you scared?" He considered this honestly. "Of what comes after?" "No." "Of leaving?" "Yes." "Those are different things." "Yeah," she said. And the vowel had a flat Canadian quality that she probably didn't know she'd absorbed from a human she'd never met, and he heard it and thought, that's what 15 years sounds like. "Yeah, me too." Lena, year 15, month 3, the return. The morning she left, Vorak walked with her to the transport dock without speaking. This was correct. She did not try to fill the silence. She had learned, over 15 years, that some silences were not empty. At the dock, he stopped. He brought all 4 arms out from his body in the formal greeting posture, the same one he had stood in when she arrived at the base of the ramp, 7 years old, with her 1 bag and her 7 memorized words. She understood it, accepted, and also beginning. The gesture that contained a completed arc. She brought her own arms out, just 2 of them, but she had learned to make the posture carry the same weight, and held it for a moment. Then she said in Vorak, "I will tell them what I know. All of it. Until someone listens. Tell them the wind comes from the southeast," he said. "And that you have to keep checking," she said. "Because it changes." She turned and walked onto the transport and did not look back, because looking back was what you did when you were finished with a thing, and she was not finished. She was only beginning a different kind of work in a different place with everything she'd been given to carry it with. Vesa had pressed something into her hand the night before. The plane case, which she had opened to show Lena once a year for 13 years. "Not the case," Vesa said. "Just this." She had placed in Lena's hand a small carved object, smooth stone, the kind of memorial marker that Vorak warrior families made after a loss. "To show them what we keep. So they know we keep things too." Lena had held it for a long time. Then she had closed her fingers around it, and it had been in her pocket ever since, and it was in her pocket on the transport, and it was in her pocket when the ship docked at the Earth relay station and the treaty coordinator in a gray suit came on board and said in a brisk official voice that all returning exchange children would be debriefed before contact with their families was permitted. She walked past him. She had 22 years of good judgment, and 15 of them had been spent becoming someone who understood exactly when to be polite and exactly when politeness was a tool being used against you. She walked past him and found the relay terminal and sent a single message to the network she and Keth had been building for 3 months. "I'm down. Starting now. Tell them everything you know." Earth smelled overwhelmingly of itself, green and wet and full of oxygen in quantities that felt almost extravagant after 15 years of Duvrak's thin air. She stood outside the station and breathed it and thought, "This is mine too. This is also mine." Her mother was at the gate. She was smaller than Lena remembered. Not smaller, actually. Lena was simply taller, and her face had the careful, controlled look of someone who had been practicing composure for a long time. When she saw Lena, she dropped the composure entirely and made a sound that Lena had not heard in 15 years and which bypassed everything. All the languages, all the training, all the careful internal architecture she'd built to carry the weight, and went directly to the 7-year-old who had stood at the bottom of the ramp and tried not to cry. She held her mother and breathed her in and felt the weight shift. Not disappear, never disappear, but change shape, the way all weight eventually does. And then she stepped back and took the stone marker from her pocket and placed it in her mother's hands and said, "I have so much to tell you." Keth, year 15, month 3, the return. Clara drove him to the transport hub. Ruth had offered, Dale had offered. He had chosen Clara, because she was the one who understood without needing it explained why he needed the last drive to be with someone who wasn't going to be stoic about it. She cried from about the halfway point. She didn't try to stop. She drove and cried with the uncomplicated fluency of someone who had learned from childhood that tears were not a failure of composure but a form of honesty, and Keth sat in the passenger seat with his lower hands in his lap and his upper hands on the door and the window and watched the mountains go past. the ones that were the blue-green of Vorak's high-altitude rock, which he had noticed in year 1 and which he was still noticing on the last day, and did not have tears to produce but had something equivalent moving through him. At the hub, Clara got out of the car and came around and stood in front of him. She was 23 years old. She was the person in the world who had first introduced him to the concept of a joke as social instrument and to the practice of sitting with someone in the dark when sitting was all that was available. She was also the person who had said, at 13, "You're going to be really far away one day," with the serious practical sadness of someone already preparing for it. "You're going to tell them," she said. "The Vorak. You're going to tell them about us." "Everything I know," he said, "which is a significant amount." "Tell them," she paused. She pressed her lips together in the way humans did when they were organizing something that mattered. "Tell them we're not brave. We're not any of the things they probably think. We're just people who are scared of the dark, and we make a lot of noise to cover it, and sometimes we do something right." She looked at him. "You already know that. But say it from the inside." "I will," he said. "I have always been more persuasive about things I know from the inside." She laughed, sudden and bright and startling, and the sound of it put a fissure in him that he understood would not close. He brought all 4 of his hands forward in the formal greeting posture, and she stepped into it, and he held her with all 4 arms for a long moment, which was not a Vorak gesture, and was not quite a human gesture either, but was something that existed in the space between, something they had invented together without planning to. "Call me," she said against his shoulder. "Every 11 days, he said. "Plus transit time." She pulled back and looked at him and did not say goodbye, because Clara Morrison had always been precise about language, and goodbye was not the right word, and both of them knew it. The transport to Vorak took 9 days. He spent the first 3 reading the briefing documents about his reintegration, which used the word reintegration with a confidence that suggested no one who wrote them had ever tried to reintegrate a person who was simultaneously completely themselves and irrevocably 2 things at once. He spent the next 3 in relay contact with Lena and the others, building the network, consolidating the plan. The last 3 he spent near the porthole, watching space, which was the one thing that looked the same from both directions. He arrived on Vorak in the thin air and the mineral taste and the smaller, fiercer sun, and felt his body recognize it, the precise pressure on his hide, the specific weight of gravity that was slightly more than Earth's, and beneath the recognition was something that was not quite relief and not quite grief but was perhaps the most honest response available. "I know this place. I do not know yet who I am in it." His creche mother was at the dock. She was older. 15 years was more for Vorak physiology than humans. She was well into her senior phase, the secondary eyes nearly stilled, and she held herself with a formal stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time without wanting to show it. When he came down the ramp, she brought all 4 arms out, and he brought his out, and they stood for a moment in the greeting posture that was also its opposite, that contained the whole arc from beginning to arriving. Then she said in Vorak, "Tell me what you found." "Everything," he said. "It will take some time." "We have time," she said. "They have not started anything yet." "No," he said. "And I intend to make that not yet as long as possible. After both of them." What the governments had not accounted for, what the architects of the treaty exchange had designed as a guarantee and not as a generation, was that you cannot send 200 children to live inside the meaning of peace for 15 years and then ask them to stand aside while people who have never done that decide the peace was insufficient. The war preparedness briefings continued on both sides. The summit remained broken. The enhanced monitoring of relay communications remained active, which meant that every message between the exchange network was logged, which meant that the volume and nature of that communication was visible to exactly the people who needed to see it. Lena appeared before a parliamentary committee in the Human Concordat in month 4. She was 22 years old, and she had Tharuk's years of training in the posture of someone who knows the terrain well enough to stop thinking about it, and she sat in front of 7 elected officials, and she talked for 3 hours. She talked about Vessa's case on the high shelf. She talked about what it meant that the word for weather reading in Vorak was the same grammatical structure as the word for understanding another person. She talked about Ran growing up next to her on a plateau that almost killed them both in the winter of year 6, and what it felt like to realize that a creature whose species had killed humans for 50 years was nonetheless the most reliable person in your world when the temperature dropped below survivable. She did not argue that war was wrong. That argument had been made and had not been sufficient. She argued instead from precision, You are proposing to restart a conflict against people I know. Not people I have studied. People I know. My garrison father taught me to read the weather using methods developed over 2,000 years of living on a rock that actively tries to kill you. My garrison mother kept a piece of her hatchmate who died in the last war, and she showed it to me every year so I would know what she was choosing not to become. She placed the stone marker on the table. She sent this with me. To show you what they keep. They keep the same things we keep. You should know that before you decide anything. Keth appeared before the Vorak High Council in month 5. He had prepared his testimony in both languages and delivered it in Vorak because precision mattered more than access and the council's translators were reliable. He talked about Ruth Morrison, who had sourced fire-dried meat from 2 towns away without mentioning the cost. He talked about Dale, who had handed him the other end of the fence wire without making it an occasion. He talked about Clara, who had said, "Tell them we're not brave. Tell them we're just people scared of the dark." The humans I know, he told the council, are afraid in ways that are genuine. The fear is not fabricated. It is a true feeling with a real history. But fear is also the mechanism by which populations are made available for war. I know this because I watched it from the inside, and I understood it by watching people who were generous and frightened at the same time, which is what humans largely are. He paused. You are considering restarting a war against people I love. I am asking you not to. Not because war is wrong, though it is, but because I can tell you with the precision of someone who lived inside their world for 15 years that the war would be against people who are afraid, which means it would be against their fear, which is a war that cannot be won because fear does not surrender. The council deliberated for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, the other exchange children, all 200 of them, scattered across 2 worlds, returning to their original cultures as strangers who were also intimately familiar, as people who were 2 things at once and could not be made into one, talked. They talked to neighbors and colleagues and journalists and local officials and school children. They talked in Vorak and English and every Creole of the 2 that 15 years had generated. They talked with the precision of people who had been given the most rigorous education in the world on a subject that no one else had studied. What the other side actually was, from the inside, without diplomacy or propaganda or the simplifying necessity of war. They were not politicians. They were not generals. They were not the architects of anything. They were the people who had lived the answer to the question, and they had decided that the answer was worth saying, louder than the question was being asked. The war did not begin in month 5. The security review was extended. The summit was reconvened. The territorial boundary dispute was referred to a technical commission that included, at Keth's specific written recommendation, 3 human members who had spent time on the affected Vorak territories, and at Lena's recommendation, 3 Vorak members who had lived on the adjacent human-settled planets. The commission took 2 years. Its findings were inconclusive on the territorial question and definitive on the human one. Both sides had legitimate historical claim, both sides had legitimate current need, and the only framework that could accommodate both was one that neither side had yet proposed because it required trusting the other side to share. This was not a resolution. It was a continuation of the not yet. But continuation, Lena had learned on a plateau that tried to kill you in the winter, was its own form of survival. You kept checking the weather. You kept looking southeast. You built relationships in the garrison that would outlast your tour. You kept the case on the shelf so you remembered what you were choosing not to become. She and Keth met in person for the first time in year 17 of the peace, at a conference in a neutral station above the boundary zone, a gathering of exchange children and their families and the officials who had made the exchange and were now, under considerable public pressure, being asked to explain what they had intended by it. They recognized each other immediately, which was strange given that they had never seen each other and slightly less strange given that they had spent 2 years in relay communication building something together. She was taller than he'd pictured. He had pictured her as small, the way his briefings had described human children, and she had grown. He was grayer than she'd expected, the adult Vorak coloring coming in fully now, the secondary eyes open and tracking with the independent attention she'd read about but never seen. They sat across a table from each other in the station's common space, with their coffees and translated water, and they talked for 4 hours about everything they had found and everything they had told and everything they had not yet managed to say that still needed saying, and it was the most efficient conversation either of them had ever had, because they were both people who had learned to communicate in translation and had emerged with a precision about meaning that monolingual people rarely needed to develop. At the end of it, Lena put the stone marker on the table between them, She carried it still and said, "Vessa's hatchmate." Keth looked at it. Then he said, "Clara once told me that music is for saying things you don't have words for. I think this is that." "Yes," she said. "I think so too." They did not solve the territorial dispute that afternoon. They did not end the political machinery that had been grinding toward war since the summit broke down. They were not large enough to stop that machinery by themselves. No two people are ever large enough for that. But they were two people who had grown up inside the other side's world and had come back carrying it, and they sat in a neutral station with the stone marker between them and the whole long history of the thing laid out around them, and they chose, deliberately, with the full knowledge of what they were choosing and what it might cost, to keep going. To keep talking. To keep looking southeast. To keep checking the weather. Because peace, Lena had told a parliamentary committee and Keth had told a high council, and both of them had told anyone who would listen, was not a thing you were. It was not even a thing you made all at once. It was a thing you maintained, every day, with the specific daily attention of someone who had learned to read a sky. You had to keep looking. You had to keep showing up. You had to understand that it changed, that it was always in motion, that the direction it was moving mattered more than where it currently sat. And you had to be willing, when someone handed you the other end of the wire, to take it. Without making it an occasion. Without requiring it to be more than it was. Just, here is the wire. Here is the work. Here is the field that needs tending. Whatever the governments decided, whatever the councils deliberated, whatever the commission found or failed to find, this much was theirs. Two people, shaped by two worlds, carrying the weight of both, choosing every day to hold it as a gift rather than a burden. They were the 100, and the 100 were scattered across two civilizations now, in parliaments and schools and commission hearings and kitchen tables and garrison rooftops, saying the same thing in 100 different voices until it was undeniable. We have been inside the meaning of this. We know what it costs. We are choosing it anyway. That was not a policy. It was not a treaty clause. It was not a guarantee that could be written into a document and monitored from a distance. It was something much older and much harder to kill, the decision of people who have loved across an impossible distance to keep the distance from winning. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.